Once a long time ago, there lived a little boy, and his name was Androcles.
What a funny name!
Oh, I think it's pretty. Androcles. Androcles.
Ha ha!
I'll bet the children didn't keep interrupting Aesop.
Who?
Aesop, Aesop. You see, that's what I mean, exactly. Could I please tell a story without any interruptions? Thank you. I still think it's a pretty name. What wasn't pretty, though, was that Androcles was a slave, and he had a very mean and cruel master. Poor Androcles. He worked from way before sunup till way after sundown. He worked very hard, but there was never any pleasing this master. Is this all there is to my life? Thought Androcles, when he had time to think even. The great forest with its lurking dangers would be a better home. One day his master flew into a rage and struck out with his whip, and because Androcles was nearest, he felt the lash across his shoulders. He tried very hard not to cry, but right then and there he decided never to take such treatment again. He would run away to the forest that very night. It can be no worse facing a roaring lion than cowering under the lash of a cruel master. So that night, Androcles ran away. The forest was a dark and frightening place, and soon poor Androcles was lost. Oh dear, he thought, being here is worse than being there. It began to grow light, and he saw strange shapes lurking behind trees. And suddenly, before he knew it, there in front of him, the most ferocious beast of the forest, a lion. Androcles was stiff with fright. The lion was roaring at him. Androcles closed his eyes. But that doesn't sound like roaring, he thought. It sounds more like moaning. Very cautiously he opened his eyes and looked into the large, wet eyes of the lion. The lion was crying. There was a large thorn in the poor lion's paw, and it was bleeding. Androcles took the paw between his hands. He pulled out the thorn and bound the paw with a strip of cloth torn from his own clothing. "There," said Androcles. "That should make it feel better." "My thanks," said the king of beasts, and he leaned over and licked Androcles a nice, wet, grateful kiss. He led him to his own cave, which was warm and dry, and Androcles lay down and at once fell asleep, and the lion stood guard. They became very fast friends. They went hunting together, and the lion taught Androcles many ways of the forest, and Androcles taught the lion a few tricks like, roll over, play dead, sit up and beg, and so forth. One day, some hunters came into the forest, and they surprised Androcles and the lion while the lion was doing his tricks. It was hard to say just who was more surprised, but the hunters captured the boy and the lion, and they took them away to the circus. Circuses in those days were different from circuses now. The emperor and all the important people would come to the circus, and they would turn loose in the arena a lot of very hungry lions. Then they would turn into the same arena a lot of poor slaves, and the lions would tear the slaves apart and eat them up, and the people would laugh and applaud. This was a circus. When the hunters got Androcles and the lion into town, they separated them. They kept the lion locked up and didn't give him any food for several days, so he would be ravenously hungry. They locked Androcles up too, and they stuffed him with food so he would be particularly appealing to an especially hungry lion. Poor Androcles. Poor lion. The day for the circus came. The emperor and his court were there. The arena was packed with screaming spectators. The lion was turned loose in the arena. He lay down. He rolled over. He was weak anyway, but he knew this was not going to please the crowd. They jeered. Then Androcles was thrown into the arena with the lion. A hush fell over the audience. The lion took one look at Androcles and staggered over to him and planted a large wet lick on his face. He was so glad to see his friend. Androcles threw his arms around the lion and stroked his mane. Well, since the beginning of circuses, the people had never seen anything like this. The crowd cheered, and when the lion sat up and begged before the emperor to spare their lives, the crowd went wild. The emperor was so amused he ordered his slave freed, and the lion released to go back to the forest. That night, back in the forest, they were lying by the fire in the lion's cave, all nice and warm. "I'm very grateful," Androcles began. "For what?" asked the lion. "Why, for being, today. See, I know how hungry you were and all." "You think I would have eaten you?" asked the lion in a shocked tone. There was a silence. "After all," the lion said after a while, "I was grateful too. When I was felled with a wounded paw, you came along and made it all well. I was grateful for that." Then, after another while, and with a trace of hurt in his voice, he spoke. "Gratitude is a quality not just limited to man." I still think Androcles is a pretty name. Oh, but here's a very pretty story. The Ant and the Dove. Once upon a time, there was an ant, and as ants go, a very nice one, and of course a very industrious one. Like all the ants before him, there wasn't a lazy bone in his body, and what's more, he enjoyed his work. He sang at it, and this made him somewhat different from most ants. There were some among the ants who didn't appreciate his vocal efforts. Not that his singing was an effort. It wasn't. By him it came so easily. See, he didn't have to try hardly at all. Maybe it was this that made the other ants frown. Nothing could be good, they thought, that you didn't have to work at. However, he got his work done, and he sang too. And at the end of the workday, he didn't seem nearly as tired as some of the other non-singers. He was thirsty, though, and near the anthill where he lived, there was a beautiful little spring, and at the end of the day, when the work was done and the singing stopped, he loved to amble down to the spring for a nice, cool drink of water. One day, it was very hot, and the work was tiring, back and forth across a dusty road carrying straws. He sang marching songs, and the louder he sang, the harder he tramped. And the harder he tramped, the more dust got in his throat. Toward the end of the day, his feet were sore and his throat was parched. He changed his tunes to "Across the Wide Missouri" and "A Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes." It didn't help. It made him more thirsty. "I bet I beat everybody to the spring this evening," he thought. And when the boss ant finally called it a day, the little singing ant hightailed it, if one can use such an expression about an ant, down to the spring. The water never looked so cool and inviting. He sipped, he gulped, he goggled, and then he leaned far out for a good, healthy swig, and he fell kaplunk into the middle of his drink. Just at this time, a dove was sitting in a tree above the spring. She had just been drinking from the spring. Fortunately for the little ant, the dove had the eyes of an eagle. She saw the ant thrashing around in the water, and quickly she nipped off a leaf from the branch she was sitting on and dropped it down into the water. It floated gently and landed near the struggling ant. He managed to hoist himself upon it, and he just lay for a moment exhausted and scared. The dove watched from above. The leaf was bobbing about, but it was a safe raft for the ant, and very slowly the breeze fanned it toward the shore. The ant realized what had happened. He had been saved, and by a dove in a tree. He looked up and weakly waved his antenna. The dove smiled and cooed. Back on dry land, the little ant shook himself. He turned toward the tree to thank the dove again, but he couldn't see the tree. He couldn't even see the sky. Everything was blotted out by the shape of a hunter. Never had anything seemed as big as this hunter. His foot was the size of a mountain. He had missed stepping on the little ant only by the width of a blade of grass. To be saved from a watery grave and then to be nearly annihilated upon dry land. The ant looked up, scarcely breathing, and way, way up in the hunter's hand was a net. "Oh, woe," cried the little ant. "He means to catch my benefactor, the dove, and she is completely unaware of her danger." Slowly the hunter brought up his net, and quickly the little ant acted. He jumped up, climbed on the hunter's foot, and bit him on the ankle. Well, this startled the hunter, and he missed his aim so that the dove had a chance to fly away. The ant had saved the dove's life. One good turn deserves another. What's the matter?
Yesterday I stepped on an ant. But I didn't mean to.
Of course you didn't. The frog and the ox, how about that? Once upon a time, the swampy meadow where the three little frogs played was always so peaceful and quiet. In summer, the hot sun baked the mud around the edges, but it brought out the good smell of the grasses. At night, the katydids sang in their shirt sleeves, and the young frogs joined them, and their cousins, the tree frogs, joined them. Summer symphonies under the stars. In winter, the small grass was gone. The tall reeds were stark and brittle, and there was ice and bullfrog footprints. Summer, winter, spring, and fall, this meadow had always been an ideal and safe place to play. Then one day, one spring day, trouble came. At first, the three little frogs didn't believe what they saw. They popped their eyes even farther out of their heads than usual and stared. They were frightened because they didn't really know what they were seeing, except that it was big and moving toward them. They did know that it was trouble. They pulled their eyes back in, turned in their tracks, and hopped for home as fast as ever they could. When they got there, their father was practicing catching flies in the master lily pad. They all spoke at once. It was awful. It was big. Help! Save us! And so forth. "Quiet!" croaked their father. "How can I concentrate?" And he pulled his lids down over his eyes, pretending to be asleep, then jumped higher in the air, snapping at an imaginary dragonfly. "There, I'm pretty big with dragonflies," he thought modestly. The little frogs were beside themselves. They squirmed and wheezed and tried to all talk at once. "I can see," said their father, "that you have something on your minds." Well, they all croaked at once, and it was impossible to tell what they were saying. "One at a time, one at a time," said their father. "Now, you, son," and he pointed with his front flipper, "clear your throat and speak plainly." "Gah, began the little frog. "What's the matter?" asked their father. "Got a frog in your throat?" And he laughed at his own joke. "Don't laugh, father. There's some awful creature come to the meadow. It has horns on its head and a big tail. And hoofs," cried another. "And it's huge, the biggest thing we ever saw." Their father laughed. "Do you know what that was?" he asked. "A witch," cried one little frog. "A monster," cried another. "Big trouble," cried the third. "Why," said their father condescendingly, "that was an ox, a simple ox." "Not so simple," cried one little frog. "He looked mean," cried another. "Trouble if ever I saw it," cried the third. "Really now," said their father, "was he any bigger than I am? I'm a pretty big frog, you know." "Much bigger," they cried. Their father puffed out his chest. "Bigger than I am now?" he asked. "Of course," they cried, "much bigger." Well, their father was slightly annoyed. He blew himself up very big. "Bigger than this?" he asked, fixing them with his stare. "Much," said one. "Ever so much," cried another. He was real trouble, cried the third. Well, their father now was obviously annoyed. As a frog, he had always felt himself too big for most ponds. "Watch this," he screamed, and he blew himself up even bigger. He was a very big-looking bullfrog, bigger than this. The three frogs just nodded, and this enraged their father. He blew himself up even more. You couldn't see a wrinkle in his skin, and his eyes were nearly popped out of his head. "This," he wheezed. "If you blew yourself up until you burst, you wouldn't be as big," said one little frog. "By half, even," said another. The third one didn't say anything. He yawned and looked away. Well, sir, the father frog was so mad he just couldn't stand it. "Watch this," he cried, and he blew, and he blew. He grew bigger, and he grew bigger. The little frogs watched in fascination. "More," they cried, "more." "Bigger," they cried, and the third little frog had an anxious look on his face. "Trouble," he mumbled. Well, sir, the father frog gave one last mighty blow, and like a balloon he went a P-O-P. He'd blown himself up. Well, what did you learn from that, children?
Don't blow yourself up.
Self-conceit leads to self-destruction. Now, the next one is about a lion and a goat. And I'll bet you didn't step on a lion yesterday.
I did.
Bobby, please. Down at the spring one day, as a matter of fact, only about a week after the little worker ant fell in, there was another curious occurrence. It was still very hot. The dove who lived in the tree above the spring was away visiting some partridges in a nice cool thicket. The lion in the forest and the goat in the field both decided that they were very, very thirsty, and they set off for the spring. They chanced both to arrive at the same time, and as hot and tired as they were, or maybe because they were so hot and so tired, they fell to quarreling about who should drink first. "Naturally," said the lion, "being the king of beasts, naturally is right," said the goat. "I am naturally more thirsty than you." "You are not." "I am too." "Why?" roared the lion. "Just tell me why." "Because I am a plain and simple goat, and I naturally am thirstier than a great king." "Exactly," roared the lion. "I am king. I have a king-size thirst." Then he tried to push the goat aside. "You, in all honesty, should let me drink first," argued the goat. "A king is supposed to care for his subjects, to rule wisely and to rule well." "I decree," roared the lion, "the wisest thing I could do now is to have a quick drink, or I shall rule no more." And this time he gave the goat a good shove. Well, the goat butted right back. "There should be a law," bleated the goat. "There is," roared the lion, "the law of the jungle, and out of my way." Well, the goat lowered his head to charging position. "I'm dying of thirst anyway," he reasoned. The lion roared. The goat shook his horns. All this time, circling overhead, was a bunch of buzzards. While the two thirsty animals quarreled below, the bunch grew bigger. The circle grew smaller. The vultures flew lower and lower, their claws sharpened and ready, their appetites whetted. These birds of prey, each praying for a quick fight below. "I do hope the lion wins," said one of the big birds, "because I love good goat." "I'm rather partial to loin of lion," said another. "Well, I'm good and hungry," said a third. "I don't care which one wins, but I wish they'd hurry. I'm almost as hungry as they are thirsty." "Well, it won't be long now," said a wise old bird, and the vultures circled even lower. The lion bared his sharp claws at the goat. The goat shook his sharp horns at the lion. The lion bared his teeth. The goat lowered his horns. "Me first," cried the lion. "Me first," cried the goat. "Somebody go first, for heaven's sakes," cried one exasperated buzzard. The lion roared. The goat bleated. The vultures waited. Suddenly, at the very same time, the lion and the goat looked up, and when they saw what was lying in wait for them, they froze. Who could argue in the face of that? "O sire," bleated the goat, after you, O subject," roared the lion. "Foiled again," cried the angry birds. Moral: it is better to drink second at the spring than to furnish food for the vultures. Now this is the fox and the grapes. Remember the fox with the unusual appetite, the one who liked cheese? Oh, I didn't tell you, did I, that he also liked grapes? Oh, he loved grapes, maybe more than cheese, especially after cheese. After he had eaten cheese, that is, grapes tasted especially good. One day, toward the end of summer, the fox was lingering over a late lunch of cheese. He held the last little piece of cheese on his tongue until it melted, and then he let it slip reluctantly but tastefully down his throat. Now, he thought, to top off this titillating taste, grapes are called for. Then he began to think where he had seen the most desirable clusters of this luscious fruit. Shall they be the iridescent white grapes or the dark and lovely purple ones? He was beginning to drool just thinking about them. He wiped his mouth with his paw and set out. He knew, gourmet fox that he was, that with fowl one had the light and with meat the dark. With cheese he chose to believe the choice was optional, so he would select carefully, deciding between the white and the purple, the largest, ripest, sweetest, juiciest. Ooh, his mouth was watering so that he was drooling all over his fur coat. He began to run. He came to the first grapevine. He stopped. He looked. He shrugged. He went on. Another white and sweet, then one dark and sweet-looking. He went from one vineyard to another. He examined. He considered. He scrutinized each vine, each bunch, each grape. None quite came up to his expectations. He was beside himself with wanting, but they must be the absolute tops, the ultimate. Finally, when he thought he would have to give up, he saw just the bunch he'd been looking for, the bunch of his dreams, larger than any bunch he had seen so far. Each individual grape a masterpiece for size, bursting with juicy sweetness, and the color not as light as the light ones, and yet not quite as dark as the other dark ones. It was the perfect bunch. It also was a little higher up on the vine. He swallowed and reached a trembling, clutching paw upward. Too high. He stretched. He stretched some more. He stood on his hind legs and stretched all he could stretch. The bunch of grapes was still too high to reach. It hung there against the blue sky, looking so beautiful and so out of this world. The fox jumped. He crouched and jumped. He got a running start and jumped. His dessert eluded him only by inches. He drooled. He rested and he jumped again. He flexed his muscles, made a wish, called upon all his hidden strength. He leaped the mightiest leap of his entire life and missed. He hit the ground, though, coming down very hard. He lay there, bruised in body and spirit. Through tear-dimmed eyes, he looked up at that bunch of grapes, so desirable, so unattainable. "Oh, well," he muttered, "they're undoubtedly sour." Moral: any fool can despise what he cannot get.